Welcome, everyone. I am Zsuzsa Csergő, Director of Virtual ESN, and I'm delighted to welcome everyone to this event, which focuses on contemporary nationalism in China. And the timing of this is extraordinary. I don't have to belabor the significance of the topic. It's not only for those of us who work in the field of nationalism studies, but also for everyone, scholars, students, policymakers beyond this field. And we are privileged to have an international panel of experts, and including our expert moderator, Dr. David Stroop, who has put together this panel for us. And they will be sharing with us our thoughts on the big question of how nationalism is likely to shape the Chinese government's response to the massive challenges that the country is facing, the world is facing. Thank you to our panelists for agreeing to do this. And I am going to hand the virtual floor over to Dr. David Stroop, who is lecturer of Chinese politics at the University of Manchester. The bios will be posted by our wonderful assistant, Lucina Poturian, in the chat. I'd like to remind everyone that the Q&A is there for asking questions. You can start typing in questions to Q&A anytime. David will be collecting them, and the Q&A section will be at the end after the presentations, but please feel free to type in any questions in the Q&A field. And I also want to mention that David Stroop is also a longtime, not just member of ASN, but also part of the leadership and of the executive team of Virtual ASN. So thank you very much, David. And I'm going to disappear for now and then come back for just a couple of minutes at the end.
Thank you, Zsuzsa, and greetings to everyone from Manchester. So I just want to briefly introduce our panel. On October 16th of 2022, Xi Jinping commenced the 20th Party Congress of the Chinese Communist Party with a keynote address and was selected for an unprecedented third term as General Secretary of the party. His speech featured familiar themes from his first two terms as he pledged to, quote, advance the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation on all fronts. Since ascending to the leadership of the party in 2012, Xi's reliance on this kind of nationalist rhetoric has caught the attention of observers of Chinese politics. Nationalism, many have argued, has become the key to the party state's legitimating narratives and the engine of political and economic mobilization that has fueled China in the Xi era. However, even as Xi spoke of the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation, China found itself beset by challenges both at home and abroad. Pursuing a path forward after the end of zero COVID policies, dealing the aftermath of the so-called white paper protests, navigating the complicated geopolitics brought about by the war between Russia and Ukraine, and competing with the United States for geopolitical influence within the post-war liberal order, all present challenges with which China and Xi's leadership must contend. Many assessments of how China might respond to such circumstances have treated domestic policymaking as opaque and nationalism as a tool which the party might use in unspecified but seemingly important ways. Rather than treating this political process as a black box, our roundtable panelists evening seeks to examine and understand the various and kaleidoscopic ways in which nationalism may explain China's behavior, or perhaps even assess the limits that rooting our explanation of China's current politics in nationalist logics might impose. Tackling all of these aforementioned issues, and perhaps even some others, our excellent panel of speakers will seek to better understand the status of nationalism in China as we move forward into Xi's third term. And so briefly, I would like to introduce our panelists quickly and then hand them over to the floor. Tonight, we are joined by Ting Luo, who is a senior lecturer of political communication at Manchester Metropolitan University, Tao Wang, who is a Halsworth Research Fellow in Chinese Political Economy at the University of Manchester, and Michael Masterson, who is an assistant professor of political science at Missouri State University. Each of our speakers will address a different aspect of this very pressing and timely conversation, as Zhuze noted, especially with the meetings between Xi Jinping and Vladimir Putin earlier this week. So without much further ado, I would like to hand over the floor to our first speaker, Dr. Ting Luo. Ting?
Thank you very much. Thank you, David, for inviting me. Right, so I would, well, in the next 15 minutes, I will introduce the nationalist rhetoric and how it manifests online. And also in the second part, I will probably talk about how this is linked to Xi Jinping's approach to internet governance. So more like how to address domestic challenge. Right, so following what David just said, so in his keynote address in the 20th Party Congress of the CCP, he pledged to advance the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation on all fronts, which is actually the ideological underpinning of his presidency since 2012. And it's also known as China Dream. Now, what is exactly is China Dream? So China Dream involves achieving the two 100s. So on the 100th anniversary of the founding of the CCP, which is 2021, building a moderately prosperous society, and on the 100th anniversary of the founding of the CCP, of the People's Republic of China, which is 2049, building a socialist, modern, strong country. Now, the China Dream's narrative is actually closely tied to the leadership and the governing legitimacy of the CCP, and it's also closely tied to the 100 years national humiliation historical narrative. So in this narrative, basically, missing the great opportunity of the Industrial Revolution make China a backward country, which in itself led to invasion and humiliation by Western powers and Japan. And this nationalist rhetoric in recent years also actually features the nationalist expression online. You can see all these have featured this narrative in Xi's China Dream. So first, we see victimhood and the century of humiliation, which forms an important part of the nationalist rhetoric. And the emphasis is actually on the 100 years of national humiliation as a result of invasion and humiliation by Western power, and all this leads to the anti-foreign sentiments or the expression of superiority over or resentment toward other nations. And we have actually witnessed this form of nationalist activism online in recent years, especially we see a lot of cases where nationalists or patriotic fans respond to external political events and engage in online meme or emoji wars to protect their hypothetical idol, which is the state, and also to protect the state's core value. And for example, just a very quick example, following the sweeping victory of the pro-Taiwan Independent Party, the Democratic Progressive Party in Taiwan in the 2016 elections, we also see that patriotic netizens jumped the Great Firewall of China to attack the Facebook page of a politician, Taiwanese politician, with emoji, with memes, right? And there are many of these kind of incidents in the past several years under Xi's leadership. And these types of nationalist expression is quite often seen when the challenge are external from the outside. But domestically, the nationalist rhetoric takes actually a slightly different form. And we also observe different expression by internet user. So when facing domestic challenge, positive energy is central to this nationalist rhetoric. Now, positive energy is actually a popular catchphrase actually promoted by the state under Xi. It's a rather broad term, but it normally refers to a cheerful mentality, actions or behavior that conform to social norms and national economic and cultural superiority. And in other words, the emphasis of positive energy is to bring positive vibe to society. But the question is, what can bring positive vibe to society in the Chinese context? Now, I'm going to share with you very briefly my recent work on China's fandom nationalism during the pandemic. So our analysis of roughly 65 million COVID-related posts by Weibo user in the year of 2020 uncover actually about 11% of these posts are related to idol promotion. So at first, it struck us like, very strange. Why would fans idol promotion posts have anything to do with the pandemic, right? So then we do some additional computational analysis of these 11%, so which is about 6 million idol promotion Weibo posts. And we uncover the majority can be classified as nationalist expressions in the sense that they try to promote positive energy. So going back to the question I posed earlier, so what can bring positive vibe to society in Chinese context? So cultural recreation that show respect and recognition to key worker, that can be positive vibes, right? A joint national event organized by the state, for example, mourning the deceased during COVID on the National Mourning Day, can bring positive vibe to the society. And also something like joint state direct campaigns, such as paying tribute to women frontline workers, can also bring positive vibe to society. And this positive contribution can also take the form of material contribution. So, for example, promoting charitable work, donating money, resources, etc. Now, these kind of all this activity might seem common not just in Chinese context, simply because it's in humans' instinct to sort of seek a sense of security and safety when facing an external threat. But what is unique in this expression in the Chinese context is the association of these positive contribution to the state, to the party state, to the sort of and the emphasis on the cultural and economic superiority of the Chinese nation governed by the CCP, and also the collective identity as a Chinese. And they also link this, you can see that idol friends, they link this explicitly to the language used by official media and authority. So for example, positive energy, or they also use the term rejuvenating the Chinese nations. So our interview actually also interviewed some selected idol fans, and they also, it kind of demonstrated that they clearly understand this is the political game in China. So you have to promote nationalist sentiments, and you have to promote China Dream. And they actively borrow these official nationalist rhetoric in their idol promotion activity, and trying to make a nationalist idol. So therefore, the idol image they promote is not just positive in terms of commercial value, but also patriotic in terms of the political logic there. Now, taking this together, so if we say victimhood and positive energy are the two important forms of national rhetoric under Xi Jinping's leadership, then it's actually also this nationalist rhetoric of Xi also shaped the leadership's approach to the role of internet, and especially when it comes to how the current government approach internet or govern internet. Now, when it comes to the governance of information and communication technology, especially the internet, the Chinese government actually faced a dilemma. Now, on the one hand, we all know that in China, especially under Xi, the internet is recognized as an important engine for economic growth. And under Xi, it's important for the realization of the China Dream, because Xi viewed the information revolution in which the internet takes a central role as a new window of alternative for China to overtake developed nations, especially the US. Now, on the other hand, we also know that the internet is considered as liberation technology. So without control, the internet can have great potential to affect the regime's stability and survival. So that's what we see before, the leadership before Xi had a bifurcated strategy toward governing the internet, in the sense that they put the party's units of the state priority censorship and public opinion guidance, while the state unit prioritize the vital role of the internet in economic and social development. And the problem is, at that time, objective and priority of these two units can often lead to conflict in decision and policy about the internet, and further weakening the ability of the central government to control the internet. Now, under Xi, actually Xi took a 90-degree shift in his approach to managing the challenging and reaping the benefit of the internet. So it's fair to say that, I would say that he actually ends this bifurcated strategy toward governing the internet, so, and adopt a unified approach. Institutionally, he centralized a fragmented institution structure which enable greater control of the internet. So these include the building of the setup of the Cyber Administration of China, which become the actual head of institution in charge of everything about the cyberspace. And when it comes to managing online discourse, the state also encourage official media to innovate communication strategy and tactics that can seize the commanding high of in the online public opinion battlefield. So for example, you see in recent years, official media and state authority, they actually appropriate digital populism and popular culture online to attract and engage patriotic netizen in inventing official culture, in using national pride or solidarity, or to be inventing official discourse to make nationalist discourse. So they are trying to make the propaganda of this China regime or nationalist sentiment more playful and more attractive to the younger generation, put it that way. And on economic development, this of course is not the focus of this talk. I will just briefly mention that Xi also introduced the Internet Plus plan together with his industrial plan. We all know that Making China 2025, aiming to speed up China's technological catch-up and leapfrog technological development stage. Now, what I want to emphasize here is a crucial feature in his unified approach to Internet is actually the substantial scale up of the partnership between the state and technological company. Now, under Xi, technological company are given preferential treatment in licensing, government funding, and procurement, making them the partners of the China regime. So they are no longer in the past. They're quite a lot of time they are seen as technological company just enact or carry out state policy or tasks. They don't have any power. They don't have any agency. But under Xi, I think they are now become the partners of the Chinese state in the realization of the China regime. And they're given agency, they're given power to provide digital solution to social and economic problems on the one hand, that also assist the state in monitoring and shifting or even conducting this kind of nationalist campaign online in order to change or shift public opinion. And the state actually outsources all these tasks in the form of commercial contracts. So in this sense, I would say that in realizing the China regime, under Xi, the state has effectively built up a partnership with tech company and made them partners who can also benefit from the great rejuvenation of the Chinese nation. So I think that's pretty much what I want to say. And if you have any question later, of course, we can explore further this. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ting. A reminder to all of our attendees that if you have questions that you want to pose to any of our panelists, please feel free to submit them at any time to the Q&A. With that being said, we will move to our next presenter, Dr. Tao Wang. Tao?
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, David, for inviting me, and it's my pleasure to be part of this terrific panel. So, to address the central theme of the panel, which is how might we expect nationalism to shape and influence China's responses to these numerous challenges, such as war in Ukraine, the aftermath of COVID-0 policy, and many others. Based on my observations and study, I would argue that the answer in part lies in the way that state propaganda uses nationalism to shape public opinion. And Dr. Luoting just gave a very vivid example of how state propaganda cultivates positive energy as one of the strategies. And to complement what she just said, I will emphasize the other side of this strategy, which is to blame the US for everything. Blaming the US for all sorts of challenges Dr. Stroop just mentioned. For example, blaming the US for the virus, the origin of the virus, the war in Ukraine, as well as the other challenges. And this strategy, blaming the US, is true in both domestic and foreign affairs. So, for example, in domestic areas, COVID-0 had been the feature policy of Xi Jinping administration. And the state media has been constantly shaping public opinion by anti-US propaganda, by either blaming the US or contrast the US with China. So one of them is regarding the origin of the virus. That according to their narrative, the virus was originated in a US military laboratory. Also contrasting the handling of the pandemic and depicting the US as a total failure, while China as a resounding victory. So one of the key words that get promoted by state media was copy the homework, or 抄作业, which means that copy the homework that China has done in dealing with COVID, and to describe how the rest of the world has failed to do so. Also, reporting US COVID deaths on Chinese news media. So one of the most important news program is 新闻联播, or also known as evening news, which is broadcast by almost all channels in China at 7 o'clock for about 30 minutes. And it has continually, nonstop, reported US COVID deaths, quoting Johns Hopkins University data for almost 3 years, even when the COVID deaths became less sort of a significant public issue in the US, especially after Omicron. So the question here is, does this blaming the US strategy work? Well, I'll argue that it works until it doesn't. The tipping point was 2022, especially in March when Shanghai was under lockdown. Since then, you can observe that the US-focused propaganda seemed to be less effective in shaping public opinion. In part, it's because of the draconian measures, like people getting locked in their apartments, start to lose jobs, lose their salaries, lose access to medical care, and even lose lives. So they get this first-hand experience, as well as information shared on social media through these channels outside of officially sanctioned channels. And those information and first-hand experience led people to question the COVID-0 policy and make the nationalist sort of propaganda less effective. And you can observe this massive shift in public sentiment around the time since Shanghai lockdown, both online and offline. And during and after Shanghai lockdown, for example, when state media attempt to boost nationalism by contrasting how great China was with how miserable the rest of the world was in dealing with COVID. And those reports tend to be ridiculous. Discontent and grievances, you can observe, were so widely shared that the state media sometimes had to shut down the comment section. And the key word, as I mentioned, in the first 2 years of the pandemic in China was copy the homework, but here in 2022, it shifted towards a new word, which is wrongnology, or wrong, which means in Chinese run, meaning emigrate from China. And the study of how to leave China or escape from China became known as wrongnology, which is in sharp contrast to this term copy the homework, which implies this national pride. So this US-centered propaganda also was widely used in shaping public opinion in terms of foreign affairs. When it comes to the war in Ukraine, and the state media tends to blame the US for the war, both directly and indirectly. So directly, the state media tends to pass on the Kremlin's propaganda materials, claiming that it was the expansion of NATO that caused the war, Russia being boxed in according to this narrative, and US and NATO manipulated Ukraine, provoking Russia. And also this blaming US strategy was done indirectly. So in the first months of the war, the state media suddenly started to commemorate the victims of the NATO bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999. So note that this timing is very intriguing because it was not anniversary. The anniversary should be in May, but they commemorated in March. And it was just out of nowhere. But the signal is very clear, which is served to remind people who the enemy is and who you should support. So this strategy of blaming the US working foreign affairs, shaping public opinion in terms of foreign affairs, well, I would argue that it has been relatively successful so far. So my co-author Han Yu and me have been working on this public opinion, Chinese public opinion on the war in Ukraine. So we did a 2 waves longitudinal studies in March 2022, which is third week of the war. We find that our sample suggests that 78.4% of Chinese respondents personally support Russia. So in a separate sample, which the Carter Center collected, they find that 75% of Chinese respondents argue that supporting Russia was in China's national interest. So it's sort of a similar result. And my courser and me were very interested in the driving forces behind this overwhelmingly high support for Russia. And we tested the hypothesis that the state propaganda facilitates public support for Russia by showing up the anti-US sentiment. And we did this two-wave survey. It was 8 months between wave 1 and wave 2. And the second wave was down in late November after the 20th Party Congress. And we found that the support for Russia had been relatively stable during this 8 months. In addition to that, exposure to state media had this likely effect of leading people to believe that US was responsible for the war, which in turn increased their support for Russia. So overall, it looks that this US-centered propaganda, blaming the US strategy, has been relatively successful in shaping the public opinion on the war in Ukraine. But there's a caveat. The caveat is that we find that surprisingly, the CCP members, the Chinese Communist Party members, were actually less likely to support Russia in wave 1, which is in March 2022. If you're interested, I would be happy to answer questions and speculate reasons behind that. So to wrap up, I argue that Beijing has a relative success in manufacturing nationalism in order to shape public opinion in foreign affairs, but has been less effective in domestic issues, especially COVID-0 policy. I will speculate that part of the reason is because of information access to information. That for domestic issues, people have this first-hand experiences and also have information channels outside of the officially sanctioned channels. But for foreign affairs, they tend to rely on those state-sanctioned channels, state media especially. So that's why the information actually plays at least a partial role in this divergence between domestic and foreign affairs. Yeah, I'll pass the time back to David.
Thank you, Tao. That was a great, another great presentation. So finally, we will have our last presentation from Michael Masterson. But before Michael begins, just another reminder to our attendees that, again, any questions that you have, feel free to put them in the chat and we will begin to compile them for our Q&A. So with that, I will hand the floor over to Michael.
So I'm going to discuss an issue that always comes up whenever you're thinking about nationalism in an authoritarian context, like China, which is, okay, so the regime promotes this narrative of nationalism, and maybe some people respond to it, but does it matter for policy if we have doubts about whether or not the citizens are able to get their preferences reflected in policy in the first place? And so there's sort of two competing ways of thinking about this. And so I'm going to give you a picture of both of those. And then I'm going to transition to talking about two recent events that are happening that are being reacted to by nationalists within China, which include both the latest balloon incident and then also US restrictions on semiconductors going to China. So the argument that nationalism doesn't matter in authoritarian context, people would argue that, okay, well, anytime the nationalism gets out of control or there's a protest that the regime doesn't support, or you're trying to get the regime to do something it doesn't want to do, the regime can simply repress. And so if the regime can use repression to shut down protests, then maybe their nationalism can't actually have an influence on policy. People might also argue that, okay, the regime controls propaganda. If propaganda is able to rile up nationalism, then maybe you can also turn that nodule down when you're worried about nationalism getting out of control. And so if the regime totally controls nationalism, then maybe it doesn't influence policy. Another argument, you see this a lot in the international relations literature, not just about China, but about leaders in general, is that, well, if we assume that leaders are rational and they're thinking about costs and benefits of policy, then maybe they don't believe any of this rhetoric that they're saying. And so it's all just for the public. And so if the leaders aren't actually influenced by it, then maybe we wouldn't expect it to be influenced, policy to be influenced either. Finally, leaders, they're most interested in staying in power. And so if you engage in nationalist behavior too much. So you get a little bit too aggressive in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, you start a war that might put at risk your goal of staying in power. And so if you're going to argue that nationalism doesn't matter for state policy, then you might also say, okay, well, the regime's first priority is to stay in power. And so they'll always use those tools of repression and control of propaganda to make sure that nationalism doesn't lead to these kinds of outcomes. And they might also argue that even these expressions of public opinion that we see that appear to support nationalism, maybe we have some doubts about that because there could be preference falsification in an authoritarian context if people think that the regime is putting pressure on people to respond that, yes, we're a nationalist or we buy into the nationalist narrative. The contrary perspective would argue that leaders pay close attention to things that are going on in social media and they actually get briefings about this, which seems to indicate that they do care about not just the nationalist narrative that they're promoting, but also what's coming back from the citizens. She even brought up on his phone call with Biden when they discussed the issue of Taiwan, she said, you cannot violate public opinion, meaning that at least he's claiming to be under pressure from Chinese public opinion on the Taiwan issue. Also, the effort devoted to propaganda implies that public opinion does matter. Because if leaders don't care about what people think, then why would so much effort be dedicated to shaping what they think? And so that does indicate that at least in liminal moments, public sentiment ought to be able to nudge policy. And we might think that that is particularly likely if there's some kind of crisis. So an accident happens, two naval vessels crash into each other, people get really upset about that. Maybe that's when nationalism might exert a particular influence on leaders. You might also question this idea that, okay, the leaders don't believe anything that they're saying, and this is just, it's strictly instrumental to get support, and say, well, the leaders, they're growing up in the same environment, they're experiencing all of the same things, they're reading the same media that citizens are, and so it might be kind of stretching credulity to say, okay, but they don't believe any of this stuff. And then another thing that nationalism might do is it might raise the perceived cost of compromise, because to the extent that the regime does care what citizens think, if there's a crisis and then the regime is seen as backing down or not staunchly defending the Chinese nation, then that could be seen as a potential political cost. And so to the extent that they're even a little more reluctant to do that, that might shape policy as well. And then finally, you might argue that, okay, well, it's not like there are regularly held national elections where citizens can vote and they can vote out the leaders if they're not seen as upholding their nationalist line. But it is the case that authoritarian leaders sometimes get removed from office irregularly, particularly if there's mass discontent. And so even if the probability of that is relatively low, the consequences of it are very high, because in a democracy, you get removed from office, you take a cushy job on a cable news show, or you retire to the countryside. In an authoritarian regime, when you get removed from office, a lot of times you end up in prison or even dead. And so even though the probability of losing office as a result of disappointing nationalist sentiment might be low, you might still worry about it a lot if you think that the consequences could be grave. And so I want to move to the recent balloon incidents where the United States says that there was a spy balloon sent from China, that it was shot down. China says that it was a weather balloon. And so there are three kind of possibilities for why this might have happened when it did, resulting in the canceling of the US Secretary of State's planned visit to China. And so you might think, okay, well, if China is going to fly the balloon, why would it happen now? So one, it could be that the state is not unitary. There's lots of different bureaucracies within the state. And so the people in charge of running the surveillance balloons might think, okay, we have general approval for this program. It's on a schedule. It's time to send the balloon. But when they do that, they don't check up with the people that are in diplomacy. And so they don't think, well, it might be a particularly bad time to do this because the US is about to have a state visit. That's what I think is probably the most likely explanation. There are two potential other ones. So one is that, okay, somehow it was planned as a result of either send a signal to the United States or to cause the trip to be canceled. The reason why I think this is less credible is that there are other indications at the same time that the leadership of the regime wanted to try to lessen tensions between China and the United States. So it seems contrary to the turn in policy that the regime was trying to take. And then another possibility that I also think is pretty unlikely is that, okay, the regime is not unitary, but someone did do it intentionally. So there's maybe like a spoiler at a lower level who doesn't want relations to improve. I think that's pretty unlikely because it would be a great risk for that person to be seen as going against the policy of the top leadership. This also feeds into the online nationalist reaction. So after this happened, the US shot down the balloon, as well as 3 other objects that we still don't know what they are, but most of the analysts that I read think that they were some kind of private weather balloon that probably had nothing to do with China, but because there was the scare of the initial surveillance balloon, it resulted in pressure on the Biden administration to act. And so you see nationalists commenting on like Chinese state media news stories about what the US has done and saying, okay, well now if the US sends a balloon, we want to shoot it down too. You also see spokesmen for Chinese state media saying, well, actually last year, the US operated 10 high altitude balloons in Chinese airspace, which the US denies. And it kind of reminds me of, or makes me think of what Tao had said about how, okay, the regime reacts to COVID by saying, okay, the US, you have these conspiracy theories about lab leaks. We have conspiracy theories of our own that it's the US. And you kind of see something similar happening where nationalist narratives in the US and China seem to feed on each other. Another big important event I think that's happening recently with nationalism is the idea that, okay, we need to create domestic capacity to produce computer chips, not just for regular use, but even the high capacity ones that are vital for functioning of things like top computers that might be used for machine learning algorithms or that are necessary for smartphones to work. And so some of the reason why this is pretty important is for the last 20 plus years, China has spent more money importing chips than oil. About 90% of the very top quality chips that are needed for things like top computers and smartphones are made in Taiwan, and South Korea produces most of the rest of these. And so while they're not made in the US companies do produce some of the components and also the designs that go into a lot of these chips. And then also there's a Dutch company, ASML, that makes the ultraviolet lithography equipment that's needed to carve the small patterns in silicon that's necessary to make faster and faster chips because you have to go smaller and smaller. And so the US has sort of led this initiative to say, we're going to put restrictions on China's ability to import chips. And so even though overall trade between US and China has actually been increasing recently, this is an area where it's been going in the other direction. And this has been a continuity between the Trump administration and the Biden administration, where the US has now imposed licensing restrictions on not just the 10 nanometer chips, but going up as of October, all the way up to 14 nanometer chips. You require a special license from the US government if you're going to send that to China. And pretty much everybody understands that if you're going to send it to a company that wants to reverse engineer it and learn how to produce it in China, you're not going to get that license. You're going to get that license if you send it to a company that's like assembling it into an already prepared product like an iPhone. And so the Netherlands banned the export of the extreme ultraviolet lithography technology already. And just recently, they've extended that ban to deep ultraviolet lithography equipment as well. And so this is equipment that operates on not as high of a frequency. And so it's not even producing the top of the line chips, but is still producing advanced chips. And so they've decided that's also not going to be exportable to China anymore. And so China's responded by making big investments domestically to try to be able to produce this, also by stockpiling chips, which is one of the reasons why graphics processing units, which are heavily used in things like machine learning applications, saw a big surge in the price because a lot of Chinese companies are worried, are we going to be able to get access to these? Let's buy a bunch of them. One major limitation of the attempts to restrict China's access to these chips is that as of now, it is not illegal for a Chinese company, even if it's one of the ones that has restricted access, to use cloud computing that uses these same chips. So the company's not allowed to buy a top NVIDIA chip, but they can use Amazon Web Services to run their same algorithm on a computer that's in a warehouse somewhere that has the same chip. And so you might argue it's unclear to see how effective this is. And it would also be very hard to ban this because you don't always know what entities are that are pulling out these licenses. And there's already indications that some of the companies that are doing this, even though they're not restricted from doing it, they've created shell companies. So it's less and less clear who's doing it, so that even in the future restrictions are imposed, it'll be harder to catch them. And so for nationalists within China, seeing this sort of confirms a narrative that's already present, that the US is trying to contain and restrict China's rise. And the idea that, it's not just, the top of the line chips, but even the chips that are like slightly less than top of the line, just shows that, it's not just, because it's national security, they just want to constrain anything that's going to fuel China's economic growth. And so while the technology element of the chips is new, there's actually a lot of continuities of like this kind of concern within China that we might be cut off from a critical resource. So Li Hongzhang, the Grand Secretary during the Qing Dynasty in 1872, wrote, suppose there is a time when points of entry to China are closed by a boycott. Then not only all of our iron factories would have to suspend work and stand distressingly idle, but also the steamships which have been built would have been unable to move a single inch without coal. What deserves more anxious thought than this? And so even though a lot of the technology to produce these chips is kind of like a new issue, the idea that China might have access to a key resource that's to be restricted is something that has like a long continuity with concern of Chinese state policy. And so some of the trends and consequences of this is with like security concerns with China and the US feeding off of each other and nationalism feeding off of each other, you see pressures in both countries to spend more on military policy. So US budget, military's pressures to increase. China is now increasing spending a little faster than general expenditure growth, which is unusual. And the rhetoric has also escalated. So Xi specifically named the US as a force trying to contain China at the National People's Congress earlier this month, when usually they just say some countries. And then also Foreign Minister Xinjiang, who was recently promoted from ambassador to the US, said that if the US doesn't hit the brakes and continues to barrel down the wrong track, no amount of guardrails can prevent the carriage from derailing and crashing, and there will surely be conflict and confrontation. And so I'll stop there.
Thank you, Michael. And thank you to Tao and Ting as well for a set of really fascinating and excellent presentations. So now we will move to our Q&A portion of the evening. I will plead mea culpa for just a moment. As I previously said, that you could submit your questions to the chat, but as Zhuzha has so helpfully reminded me that actually you're not submitting to the chat, you're submitting to the Q&A box. So if our audience has questions, we might submit them there. I might get us started quickly with a question that I might pose to all of our panelists. All of your presentations have been really interesting in the ways that they have talked about how nationalism potentially serves as a legitimating tool or a mobilizational resource that the party state might use, that she might harness for certain types of objectives. And yet in each of your presentations, we have seen limitations, and you have spoken about limitations on how nationalism might be used. And with my collaborator and mentor Paul Good in the audience, I'm going to ask what I think would be the Paul Good question here, which is, to what extent are we witnessing a kind of process by which nationalism in China is perhaps becoming banal or taken for granted, that the mobilizational or sort of political tropes are becoming rote and sort of internalized in a way that can be easily sort of reproduced, but perhaps not deeply and meaningfully felt in some ways. I would be curious to hear what each or any of you has to say, if anyone would like to consider that question to start us off.
So I guess I'll start maybe. I have some research that's kind of looking at this, because you could argue that it's very cheap to say, okay, well, I'm just going to express some nationalist sentiment online, and so it's just sort of rote and it doesn't really reflect emotion. So we exploit data on Weibo where you can see the kind of device that users use to post. And so we're able to see, okay, the people that are saying that China should put more economic restrictions abroad, are they less likely to buy cell phones from the US and Japan? And so we think, okay, well, maybe it's activated like when there's a crisis. So like you say this stuff all the time, but then there's a crisis and then you get emotional, maybe you respond. And so we found that during the period after the Diaoyu Islands crisis with Japan in 2012, the people that had made these statements that China needs to be more economically nationalist were less likely to buy US brand phones or Japanese brand phones, which suggests that at least people are willing to pay some cost, or at least a significant segment of the population is, that are reflected in these sentiments, even if all the time, it might not be fully emotionally active.
Thank you, Michael. Ting or Tao, do either of you have thoughts that you want to respond to that with?
I'll just maybe go first if you don't mind, Ting. So I think, yeah, I actually observed, that's just the observation, but I observed something that sometimes the blaming the US strategy became so cheap that people just use that term sarcastically. For example, when there's a car accident, people will leave a comment on social media that oh, it's Biden's fault, which is trying to borrow the state media's propaganda, but to ridicule the situation. But still, so that's but just anecdotal and observation. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in my case, what I would say is, especially when it comes to idol fans, so those who follow celebrity online, especially idols, in making those idols, you need to actually engage in a lot of chart beating activity online. What I see, at least from the interview, a lot of idol friends, they are aware of what they are doing, so they basically internalize these political logic. So for them, at least they change their behavior, also according to this nationalist rhetoric, in the sense that a lot of them mention like they would prefer to follow domestic idol rather than foreign idol, because foreign idol are likely to have what they call positional problems. So in case they would support Taiwan independence, or in case they would say something that's going to violate one China principle or some other baseline China core value that the CCP is promoting. So they tend to change their behavior as well when it comes to what idol you're going to follow. So I think that's something I observe in my study. Yeah.
Thank you. So we have a question from Paul Good, who writes, thanks for these excellent presentations. The parallels in nationalist discourse between China and Russia is fascinating. Could the speakers perhaps say a bit about how depictions of Russia have shifted, if at all, in nationalist rhetoric in China? So this is an open question to each of you, but I think since perhaps Tao sort of dealt with Russia explicitly in his presentation, I'd give him the first pass at this. So Tao, would you like to start maybe our discussion on this round?
Yes, yeah. I don't study this sort of a change over time, but just based on my observation. So one thing that was probably noticeable is the personal cult of Putin. That started a few years ago, but especially this is very notable in the war, because in part people support the war. They will argue that because Putin is a strong man. So that in the past it's more like Russian is sort of a warrior nation. That's according to the online narrative, but now it's more focused on a single person. That's Putin. But just I think we need to keep in mind that Russia and China has a long, I would say, bitter and sweet relationships. It's not just always a romantic relationship. And in the past, there was conflict and the split between Soviet Union and China. So for a long time, I think the suspicion about Russia, especially Russia's intention about Chinese territory, has been widely shared. That's just sort of a change over time. Yeah, I'll stop here, but I would add something else if something else comes up to my mind. Yeah.
Thank you. Ting or Michael, would anyone like to take a shot at this question as well?
I guess just briefly, one thing that I've noticed reading Chinese state media commentary on the Ukraine conflict is that in 2002, like around the summer, like you were starting to see, like at least among a couple of commentators that I read, like maybe even some veiled criticism of Russia, where they would say, like they would use like an old Chinese saying that means like, the use of soldiers should be like only a last resort. And like it's unclear like who that applies to, but it's in an article about the Ukrainian conflict. And then when you scroll down and read the comments, you can see that at least some of the readers seem to have interpreted this as, oh, they're criticizing Putin. But then the same authors later, like towards the end of September or October 2002, they stopped doing that. And they started like echoing like more heavily like the pro-Ukraine line. And I mean, obviously it's impossible to know for sure why, but my impression is that maybe there was some uncertainty about, okay, what is the top leadership going to sort of double down on this line of unlimited partnership, or is there like room for some adjustments? And it seems like Xi has gone more towards the unlimited partnership direction. And so there's possibly become less room for representations of the war in Ukraine that are not pro-Russia.
I'll just add one comment here. During the war, there were actually quite a lot of social media posts trying to pass on information that they get from different sources about human casualties, and also the loss of the Russian army. But they very easily get censored. That's one noticeable trend. And a lot of accounts actually they get deleted simply because they side with Ukraine. And second comment I will add here is there are also people who aired sort of their suspicion about Russia, especially highlighting the history that Russian occupied the northeast part of China, a huge, massive territory. And they also get censored very easily. So yeah, it's probably the state's intention to do so. And it's very hard to tell the full picture of the public opinion because given the censorship. Yeah.
I think I just quickly add on what Tao and Michael just said. So I don't do anything about how the government portrays Russia and the Russia-Ukraine war, but I have been following, because of my work on social media users, so I've been following social media discussion actually on this topic. And I actually see there are quite a number of, for example, on Zhihu, that's a little bit like quarrel in outside of China. I actually seen a lot of discussion, talking about, when they talk about these Russian and Ukraine war, they are supporting Russian simply because they see, you can see the victimhood kind of nationalist sentiment there, because they see Russian as, Russian is just standing up to protect its own interests because it has been bullied by the US. And you see a lot of social media, at least some social media users are actually buying these narrative. And I feel like this has some connection as well to how China portray, we have been invaded by the Western powers in the past and have been humiliated. So I can see these kind of parallel there as well. Yeah.
Thank you all. We are still open for questions from our audience. So if anyone has questions that they would like to submit, please feel free to do so to the Q&A. As we sort of wait for further questions, I would like to sort of open up, I guess, a sort of question that sort of ties in aspects that each of you have sort of mentioned, particularly the relationship of online spaces to the spread of nationalist discourse, both within and without China. Do you find in your observations that there are differences between the way that people express their views of the nation domestically versus how they are expressed on sort of international or sort of outward-facing platforms? Is there a difference between, say, how people talk on platforms like Weibo or Zhihu and how they talk on platforms like Twitter or Reddit or somewhere else? Would be curious to hear what any of you have to say about this. I wonder, Ting, if you might want to share some thoughts on this to start us off.
Yeah, I think this is a good question, but it's kind of, I don't have any evidence at this stage, but I think definitely it will be different, but not just because they are different platforms, they have different affordances and they attract different audience. Also because if you compare Twitter to Weibo, and one is outside of China, the other one is in China, we have the Great Chinese Firewall that blocking separated these two. So it's actually hard to kind of say, because you have to look at the same person, whether they express, when they are within Weibo, how would they express nationalism, and if they jump the Great Firewall on Twitter, would they say it differently? At this stage, I think I don't have anything to say about this, I would say, But that's also something I hope to be able to work on in the future, because but it's also a very hard topic, a very hard question to answer, I would say, to research about as well. Yeah.
Tao or Michael, do you have thoughts on any of these questions?
I mean, in part, answerizing whether this this netizen is sort of an insider, a Chinese, a PRC citizen, right? If people from within China, they use different platforms and using their profile like publicly, especially a YouTuber, or they might have another channel, believably. So those tend to, I think, be relatively consistent, and consistent in the sense they censor themselves very heavily. I've observed some of those YouTubers who have channels. Sometimes they don't even have channels within China, but they still they will stop criticizing the government and things like touching on the sensitive topics. So in that sense, I think the consistency still exists. That even they use different platforms, in part because they physically they're in China. Yeah.
Thank you, Tao. Michael, do you have anything you'd like to add to that conversation?
Not really. I think they covered it very well.
Okay. Again, we are still open for a Q&A from our attendees if there are any. And we still certainly have time left. I think as we still wait for Q&A to roll in, something that I wanted to sort of ask Michael about, actually, just to while we're sort of focusing on Michael, thinking about the ways in which fields like semiconductors and other types of sort of strategic military interests, but also interests around production, have become nationalist issues or embroiled with nationalist issues. I wondered if you could maybe give some of your thoughts on where you see maybe the future of maybe tech competition as a nationalist struggle between China and other countries in the future, particularly perhaps the US.
Well, there's definitely the increasing concern that within the Chinese leadership that there's going to be key sources of technology that for China to have a reliable supply, it needs to be able to produce domestically, because both the sanctions on Russia from Ukraine, but also the restrictions that the Chinese government is now experiencing directly from the United States about sending the most advanced semiconductors have really reinforced this. And so one thing that we've seen is lots of large investments within China to try to develop this technology. And it's too early to say how successful it's been. I mean, I know the head of the Dutch company that produces the lithography equipment has said it's basically inevitable that eventually China will be able to produce it, but it's a question of how long that would take. Some assessments that I've seen of whether or not China has been successful, that quote people that are anonymous to be critical, have said, maybe it's not working that well. The Chinese attempt to develop lithography equipment, some people were saying that were supposedly from the industry that well, it was mostly developed by academics who wanted to develop equipment that could theoretically do this, but they didn't have any industrial engineers that are could we actually put this in a factory and use it? And so far, no companies have been able to actually use it within China to produce the chips. But one trend that I noticed recently is that the government seems to be putting more of an emphasis on the larger, more successful technology companies, rather than just saying, okay, we're going to invest a lot of money in this particular area to try to develop this technology. And so I guess it remains to be seen whether or not that's effective, but that does seem to be the latest move.
Thank you very much. I think perhaps we have time for maybe one more round of questions, if there are any from our audience. So I will again welcome submissions to the Q&A. If there are any to be had, and if not, as I continue to have the privilege of being the chair and calling all of the shots. I wondered if maybe we could think about one last sort of question about taking these sort of often abstract or sort of third image, to use an IR term, thinking about how these sort of nationalized discussions of nationalism between the US and China, or China and Russia, have an impact on the everyday lives of people in China. What kinds of experiences do you think, whether it's sort of the people who are posting on Chinese social media, or the people who are responding to questions about the war in Ukraine, or even the people who are sort of trying to assess the impact of semiconductor competition, how does this really affect the lives of ordinary Chinese citizens? Would anybody like to jump in and start that?
I guess it depends on how you see by impacts, right? So if you're talking about the everyday life of an ordinary citizen, I feel like they're putting on different personas. So one is online, the other one's offline. So offline, it's nothing related to the image they presented online. That's so they have a dual personality, put it that way, a dual person there. So online, maybe they a little bit patriotic, and they are kind of trying to protect their states, and they're kind of a little bit extreme on that as well. But then offline, in a private life, you might not see the same person, I would say.
Thank you. Tao or Michael, do you have thoughts that you'd like to add?
Maybe I can just give some source here. I think one consequence of nationalizing those nationalizing narrative is that, for example, when students here in study in the West, they go back to China, people in China will ask, which country did you study? And that will impact their job prospect as well. People will ask, oh, why do you study in the US? Which implies that you're studying our enemy country. So that is one of the consequences I will argue. But here, I also want to add here that just using COVID-0 as an example, that sometimes public opinion on certain issues don't have this coherent, persistent sort of a system. It's not systematic ideas. And when the state media changes this direction on COVID policy, the impact on public opinion is quite also very strong, in the sense that people start to comply with this new policy, which is just don't care about COVID at all. But the reason I use this example is that when the state changes the propaganda machine changes direction, that then the public opinion also sometimes shifts very quickly as well. So may not overestimate the impact of nationalist narratives that state promotes at the moment.
Thank you, Tao. Michael, do you have anything you would like to add to this question?
Yeah, just briefly, thinking of when Tao mentioned students, there's also, I think, the perception, which I think has some basis, that the environment for them in the United States has become more hostile with the rise of hate crimes against people that are perceived to be of Asian descent. And so I think that, and like also the perception that like the political environment and like the granting of visa, all that's like more hostile, more difficult, is also like a factor where, I mean, seeing less Chinese students coming to the US to study, and maybe some of that is a legacy of the pandemic, like travel is difficult, but I think also some of it is due to the perception that the US is less hospitable to people who are thinking of visiting from China.
Okay, thank you very much. I believe we have one more question in the Q&A, and I know we are pressing up against the limits of time, so I'll have this be our last question. And actually, I believe it's sort of there are sort of two questions with a similar bent. Zhuzhe asks if there is any sort of tension between China's interest in economic openness and its interest in cultural protectionism, sort of an international versus a domestic sort of contrast there. And Chandler Rosenberger writes, does anyone else find that Xi Jinping's style of Chinese nationalism puts a stronger emphasis on China's distinctive culture than previous presidents' previous leadership? If so, might this help smooth the way towards reunification with Taiwan? So if anyone has any last thoughts on that, I would be happy to hear them.
Maybe I can just respond to the Chandler's questions. Yeah, I think Xi Jinping's style of Chinese nationalism does put a lot of emphasis on this uniqueness of Chinese culture. That, you know, if you look at the COVID, the pandemic period, he attributes the success of handling the pandemic to both the political system as well as Chinese culture. He emphasized in his speech. But will this sort of emphasizing culture facilitates the unification with Taiwan? I doubt that, because partially the Taiwanese identity is not solely based on cultural identity. Actually, the bulk of the identity is based on the political values. It's a liberal democracy. So I think by emphasizing the cultural distinctiveness of the Chinese-speaking culture, I'm not sure the chance is high. Yeah.
Michael or Ting, do you have any last thoughts on this question?
I think I share what Tao has just said. I think I agree that we do see under Xi Jinping, he emphasized a lot this distinct Chinese culture. Maybe this work for people living in mainland China, but I don't think this would work for people from Taiwan, because, well, being Chinese doesn't mean, you know, you have to be in one China. So I think this would not, I would doubt whether this would actually smooth the unification of, you know, with Taiwan. Yeah, I think so. Basically, I share the same as Tao have just said. Yeah.
And I guess I'll take the first part of the question about the tension between economic openness and economic nationalism, and which I would say I think there is definitely a tension, because the idea is that, you know, economic nationalism, we want to be able to produce this domestically. It might be vital for national security, whereas economic openness, you know, you want to use comparative advantage to get specialization, and if it's produced more efficiently in other countries, let it be produced there, we'll import it, and overall we'll have more goods.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael. I want to turn the floor briefly back over to Zhuzhe, but before I do, I want to thank all of our presenters, Ting, Tao, and Michael, for their excellent insights, their wonderful conversations, and also I want to thank our audience for their questions. So this was a real pleasure, and Zhuzhe, I will hand things back over to you.
Thank you, David, and I'm back only to thank you and all the panelists for this really stimulating, thought-provoking conversation by experts, and on some of the most significant, challenging questions that are arising right now. And I'm hoping that we will continue integrating China into the ASN field, and this is what virtual ASN can do. So our convention, you know, ASN for institutional legacy reasons, and essentially also reasons of space at the Harriman Institute at Columbia, has been focusing mostly on Eastern Europe, Russia, Eurasia, and I don't think that we can change that dramatically for the convention, but we are hoping to use virtual ASN, which is the other platform that we can use between the conventions and throughout the year to address questions both in the ASN's traditional regions, which we find that those are our core regions, and there's plenty going on right now with Russia's full invasion of Ukraine and the consequences of the war. But there are also very significant issues around nationalism in China and other regions of the world. So I'm hoping that we can continue to use virtual ASN for that purpose. This is why we have created it as a global platform. So thank you for contributing to that, for volunteering your expertise to help share this knowledge through virtual ASN. I also want to remind everyone that the ASN convention is finally able to go back to in-person meetings. The convention will be at the Harriman Institute, Columbia University, our usual place, our home, institutional host, from May 18th through the 20th. And I also want to remind everyone that ASN also has a usually biannual European conference, which we had to postpone a few times, but we are finally able to organize that as well. So ASN Cluj, Romania, will take place from July 6th to July 8th. And the call for papers deadline is March 31st at the end of this month. And I'm hoping that you will take a look at the call for papers. If you just type in ASN Cluj, the website comes up, and that you consider coming there. So those are also very exciting in-person conferences, and we're happy to be back this year. So thank you, everyone, panelists and attendees, and I hope that you will keep going back to the ASN website and also participate in the virtual ASN events. You will be getting invitations as the next public event will be in the pipeline. Take care, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.